Unfortunately, the FTC commissioners got stuck and actually can't get here at all. So it's unfortunate. It's also cost them a couple days of productivity too, which is also unfortunate. So we're going to move up a discussion that Sarah will have with Stu Alderati from Ripple to that time. And the net effect for you all is that there will be a little extra free time in the afternoon, and nobody's complained about that in the past. So let me just go ahead. Okay. So this panel will be discussing productivity growth. So one of the biggest and most consequential puzzles today is why productivity growth is still so low despite rapid technological innovation. And solving this puzzle is crucial because productivity growth is necessary for economic growth, which itself is necessary but not sufficient to make everyone in society better off. Without it, one person's economic gain is another's economic loss. And so the question is, of course, why, with all this technological innovation, do we still see productivity growth being so low? It seems to contradict everything we think about all these great innovations and so on. And I should have a slide. If it doesn't go up, that's okay, where you can see productivity growth changes over time. And if you look back all the way to 1948, there's a pretty clear downward trend. Steadily downward. I mean, it goes up and down at some times, but it was a big deal last year in 2018 when BLS announced that we had 1% total factor productivity growth, which historically still isn't great, but that was kind of a big deal that it got that high. So this panel will discuss that issue. I'm going to introduce the panelists just very quickly. Their full bios we have their full bios, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. You know Susan. And it's in alphabetical order. So Carol Corrado, sitting next to her, is a senior advisor and research director in economics at the Conference Board. Her primary focus is measuring intangible capital and studying innovation and economic growth. She also works on the Conference Board's China Center for Research in Economics and Business on measuring and analyzing industrial capacity. And she's a member of the executive committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Conference on Research on Income and Wealth. Leonard Nakamura is vice president and economist and head of the Regional and Applied Microeconomics section of the Research Department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which is responsible for producing their business outlook of survey and state coincidence indexes. He's written many articles on real estate economics, banking, measurement, investments in intangible assets. Pei-Ling Yin is an associate professor of clinical entrepreneurship and director of the Technology Commercialization, there's that slide, initiative. She co-founded the Mobile Innovation Group to study the mobile app ecosystem, from industry evolution to platform competition to entrepreneurial strategy. And she's now teaching tech commercialization and co-created required new course in the MBA program. So you can see that's it. Now, everybody knows it's really not fair to just draw a simple regression line through a time series, especially like this. So don't ever do something like that. It's just terrible. But still, you can see we've got a downward trend there, right? And then you can see the little upward jump in 2018 to 1%. Okay, so now let's put it back onto Slido. so that people can ask questions as we go. And I'll try to keep up with Slido also and pose the questions to the panelists. But let's just start with the sort of basic question. Why was there a slowdown? I don't know if Carol or Leonard wants to start, and I'm not sure you all agree on what the answer to that question is.
Well, let me just say, there's a large literature on this subject, and it tends to advance at least 4 or 5, different reasons. Initially, when this literature emerged in the context of the current cycle, the most prominent theme was the IT revolution is over. Well, I think that's been put to bed, so we won't talk about that. We can talk about how it's measured, however. The other ones had to do with, on the one hand, non-technological forces, such as secular stagnation or a hangover from the Great Recession. And then there's a really major focus on mismeasurement. This is important in the context of the digital sector, and it has sort of 2 aspects: within GDP or beyond GDP. So what don't we do right within the confines of the way the current system is structured? Oh, by the way, maybe we should change it because the economy's really moving at a fast pace and we're not capturing all that's going on. And then finally, I think the last reason that's gaining some currency is something I would just call the misunderstanding of history's lessons. And this takes various forms, but it all goes back to a fundamental sort of observation from economic history, which is when there's a technological revolution, it takes a long time for it to permeate through the economy. And this is the story why all these wonderful AI techniques that we know are going on, and we know that there's vast investments in them, that's just going to take a while. And I put half of my finger there and half of my finger on, well, sorry, I guess I need 3 fingers. I put one finger there, I put another one on mismeasurement, and then the non-technological forces, I think, are understudied, and I think are at play.
So I think that the entire slowdown is due to mismeasurement. That if you actually look at the economy around us, it's clear that the US economy has accelerated rather than slowed. If you look at the period from 2005 to 2017, real GDP growth per person has been less than 1%, about 0.8%. In the previous post-war period through 2005, there was never a 12-year period in which you had real GDP growth per capita as being less than 1.6%. So we've had a very dramatic slowdown in real GDP growth, and this has happened at a time of the mobile internet, cheap DNA sequencing, cheap space exploration, LED lighting, electrical batteries, self-driving cars. You can go on and on. It's both within the internet and well outside the internet. And so I believe that the economy has accelerated, but that we don't measure the kind of economic growth that we've been creating. And one of the things I'll be saying is that if you look at the big tech companies, you can see clearly that as we measure them, they contribute negatively to GDP, not positively. They're subtracting from output as we measure it.
So this isn't a little bit fair because I'm putting words in someone's mouth, but Chad Syverson says that mismeasurement isn't the issue at all. And so I'm sure you must have had this discussion with him in the past. So what is your response to that, to Chad's work?
Well, Chad is working within the framework of GDP. And one of the big problems is that GDP does not do well with zero pricing, right? if you don't have a transaction, it doesn't show up in GDP. GDP is all about deflating transactions, right? And yet, in the digital world, the marginal cost of reproduction has gone to zero, right? So the natural price in a competitive world of all kinds of products is zero. Now, of course, we still have to support the production of the initial knowledge or entertainment. So, you know, we have intellectual property rights and so on and so forth that raise prices above zero. But those are really, in some sense, only temporary phenomena, right? That as the intellectual property rights go away, things naturally go to zero. But even in the short run, what happens is that instead we support stuff indirectly by bundling them together or by supporting them with advertising and marketing, right? And you know, finally, the problem is that there's a really broad-based problem that our statistics do not measure improvements in quality. The way BLS collects statistics, the default is always that there was no quality improvement. And yet, that's the entire way that our economy is advancing. We no longer need greater quantities of things. We're too fat, our closets are stuffed with stuff, we need advice about how to throw things away. You know, quantity is not increasing. I don't know if the statistics are right, but if you go to the Department of Transportation website, over the last 10 years, ton miles of freight have fallen rather than risen. For the rest of the post-war period, ton miles of freight were rising pretty well. So, you know, the economy has really moved away from quantity, and what GDP is good at is measuring quantity.
Yeah, Carol.
Well, yeah, I don't disagree with much of what Leonard said, but I think there's some nuances with regard to how we should interpret, like the position of Chad Syverson, who spoke on this panel, a panel like this, was it 2-3 years ago?
3 years ago, yeah.
Yeah. Well, number one, with the passage of time, the productivity, just simple labor productivity, which is the easiest way to talk about it, has revised up in productivity terms massively, okay? And these reflect both a better performance of the economy and improvements in measurement. I mean, we are now at the point where the Congressional Budget Office, which regularly issues projections of potential economic growth, where they project potential labor productivity to grow at, I think it's like 1.8% or 1.9%. This is not that far from the long-term historical average. So I mean, the questions we need to be asking ourselves is this the new normal, or should we go back to what some people call the bubble years of 95 to 2005? I think we are for sure closer to the latter than the former, personally, and that's what Leonard is saying. But we have structural problems in this economy. I mean, right now, the population aged 65 and over is growing 10 times faster than the population of the working age population. That is just placing an enormous strain on the adjustments that need to be done. And by the way, we should feel lucky because in China it's worse, in Europe it's worse. I mean, we're much better off. But still, it's a massive adjustment that needs to take place. And GDP is not good at capturing anything having to do with health or social welfare or anything having to do with a lot of these changes. The other non-technological thing that we have to bear in mind, and this is raised in a series of works by Larry Katz, and I've seen it in my own more direct measurement work, which is that the entrants into the labor force are less educated than they were in my generation, for sure. And that just sounds odd, but that's the way it is. So we do not have the influx of highly skilled workers that we did relative to other workers 10, 20 years ago. And I don't know what we're going to do about that, and I don't know how to forecast what that means. But it is a fact, and that is something that we in the United States have. We're at a relative disadvantage on that score compared with Europe or China.
Well, wait, so you're saying a couple of things. One is that it may be the case that we're reverting back, at least in labor productivity, to something closer to what our historical average has been. But on the other hand, the trends looking forward are not good. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, well, there's these non-technological trends that are not good, which means that what we need to get from technology is at least as much, if not more, than what we got in the so-called bubble years.
So that's actually a good way to go to Pai Ling. Since you've worked more on sort of the micro issues and how firms adopt technology, and that's what kind of the foundations of productivity growth. Talk about that a little bit, if you.
So first of all, I need to thank Susan Athey. She was my advisor, so so I benefited from her as well at Stanford. So I have to give a big thank you and shout out. And so just for full disclosure, I've been able to work with a lot of entrepreneurs as well as talk to the scientists who are trying to build out firms at the University of Southern California and get into this area of technology commercialization. And I think, I'll mention two things that I think that relate to firms and deals with this productivity issue. And one ties back to what Susan said earlier about those credit agencies where the people don't trust the algorithm. I think one of the big things that I've written before with Tim Bresnahan on is that there is a process by which firms and technology work together. So you can't just say that it's all about technological determinism and we're just going to follow these technologies. Ultimately, the firms are involved in making decisions about the rate and direction of that technical change. So if you don't get your workers to feel like they have a buy-in into this new technology, that it actually will help them rather than replace them so that they don't feel threatened, that they understand it, then you're not going to get the technology adoption very quickly. And I think this goes to Carol, why it takes so long for every technology over time to be adopted is because technology works with not only people but organizations and firms. And so if it's not making sense to that firm as a profit maximizing adoption, if it's not making sense to the worker as something that will help them in their job, then it just doesn't happen. I think too often firms forget about the nitty-gritty of how they have to deal with their organizations and think about those incentives to get things adopted. I think another area that I want to raise for everyone in the room that I think is interesting, and I don't know what the answer is, but so I spend a lot of my time when I'm in the Uber, or actually I mostly use Lyft, but I spend a lot of time in Lyft asking the driver, so what are you doing? And then they ask me what I'm doing. I'm like, oh, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at USC Marshall. And then they're like, oh my gosh, that's great, because I'm coming up with this app, and this app, and this app. And so, and they're a Lyft driver, right? So in some sense, they're already an entrepreneur. And I think that one of the things that technology has allowed us to do is increase the number of people who think that entrepreneurship is actually accessible to them. So I study mobile apps. I tell them, look, this is probably a bad idea. Like, you need a lot of advertising to even get known. But there are a lot of people who, with technology, feel like, hey, the costs are lowered for me to try something. And so that means that those are people who normally might have applied for a job that's in some company, but didn't, right? They're going to do something else. And I think Carol and Leonard, actually, for all the work you're doing on measurement, because I think understanding what does that mean, that entrepreneurship is an opportunity, and yet we know that most entrepreneurs fail. Like, what does that mean for our labor productivity as well?
Susan?
Yeah, that was all very well said, and maybe I just want to expand on a few of those points with examples. So, by the way, unlike these guys, I actually don't study this issue, so I'm a consumer of their research rather than a producer. But when I see the firms, going through adoption of some of these important technologies, like say cloud technology, it is very important to think about the time frame in which you see improvements. And this is a point that you guys have talked about in your research as well, but you didn't highlight as much yet today. And this, when I look at very well-run, well-managed implementations of an older firm moving all of its software to the cloud, that's at least like a 5 to 7 year time frame before it would improve your bottom line in the firm. The whole time you're moving, you're keeping all of your current data centers operational. You've got all of your staff working double time trying to keep the existing operations going at the same time that you're porting over and developing new applications. So it's quite a big and risky and expensive endeavor. And of course, you're seeing a lot of financial institutions trying to go through this transformation right now, as well as any kind of tech firm that was born before about 2010 has to sort of redo everything and move it to the cloud. So ultimately, if you do it well, this is going to be beneficial, but you need to have a long-term perspective, and of course, you need to manage the transition, because firms aren't really that good at managing like 7-year projects. They tend to, that messes around with people's incentives and so on. And at some point, I was at a conference with a bunch of the Fortune 100 companies, and all the CEOs kept coming up and saying, well, we're a tech company now, we're a tech company now. And my reaction was, wow, first of all, I see why you say that, you have to be. But second, like some of you are going to die. Because if you actually try to transform your current organization with its current people into a tech company, that might just be very hard. You might actually not be able to manage the cost of the transition. So I think that if, of course, if people realize that's a barrier to adoption, and then the ones that have embarked on it, there's a multi-year payoff. But my own personal view is that just looking at cloud computing, that by itself is sort of a transformative technology. And even if I look at my little lab at Stanford, right, I got this data set that had GPS data from a large millions and millions of people over many, many months. And huge data set, and we were able to use cloud computing to analyze that data set. It was still a budget, tens of thousands of dollars of compute, but a very manageable budget. And then now that the tools have gotten so good, and there's all this open source software, I can hire master students or undergrads. I even had a high school student this summer working on it. And be able to do analytics like at scale, a total budget of maybe $200,000 to do like all the data storage, compute, analysis on this massive data set, where 10 years ago, that would have been a multi-million-dollar project for any firm because nobody had the infrastructure. And even like when I worked at Microsoft Search Engine, we were trying, before the public clouds and so on, we were writing all of the software just to do analysis on those data sets, and that was very expensive to develop. And so now, because of the economics of cloud computing, people are giving that software away for free to try to get you to use their clouds, or giving it away very inexpensively. And of course, then you think, all right, where's that going to show up? Well, it's reducing costs. It's allowing people to do new projects they wouldn't do before, but a lot of those new projects are actually improving quality of existing services or creating free services, creating the mobile app for a bank or a service and so on, which is actually, not necessarily showing up in either an expansion of output or an increase in price. So these things are very transformative, but very hard to measure.
So let me back up for a second, and this question is, well, maybe it's a little self-serving, but I think we often hear these days there are criticisms of statistical agencies and the work that they do. And so why does this matter? If we're just, why does it matter if we're mismeasuring productivity or anything else? I mean, how does that affect the real economy? I mean, part of the answer actually is in this very interesting top question that we should get to in a minute, one possible answer. But anyway, tell us why is this important? Why does it matter to the real world?
Well, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
So one interesting question is, what is the rate of inflation when you have a lot of zero-priced products, right? And I would argue that if the economy has accelerated rather than slowed, that we must have an acceleration of mismeasurement of inflation by at least 1%, right? And plus, we've known all along that inflation is undermeasured. So it's quite possible that we're undermeasuring inflation by a couple of percent. If that's true, then we were deflating throughout the Great Recession, right? And the reason that the Fed's efforts to spur the economy by keeping interest rates at zero weren't strong is because we were deflating. And when the Fed raised the interest rate, the Fed funds rate to over 2% recently, the Fed's impression was that the real rate of interest was just barely positive then, and that it was not actively slowing the economy. But the economy slowed. It's possible that, in fact, if we're still deflating, that a 2% interest rate is discouraging to the economy. So that's one application in which this might make a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, Leonard makes a very good point about inflation. And I have a little note coming out with one of my longtime collaborators at the Federal Reserve on measuring inflation in a mobile era or something like that. And it's been sitting on the desk of some of the higher ups for issues of interpretation. But the facts are that if you put into the Fed's preferred measure of that they use for their inflation targeting, the personal consumption expenditure deflator, excluding food and energy, if you put in all the cumulative research that people have done to improve the measurement of quality, both of goods and my latest work on digital services, you get an acceleration of mismeasurement in the last 4 years. And the extent of that is averages 0.6 of a percentage point a year. So the typical graph that you see of this inflation rate is that it's decelerating, okay, and this just totally, changes the slope, and yeah, so it's a very real concern. It's hard to know how to operate in a period like this, but that's where we are. On the other hand, we do know that costs, real costs in the sense of imported materials and things like that are for businesses that do make goods, physical goods, they are going up. So you've got a real bifurcation in the economy, and I think that that policymakers, be they antitrust, people in the antitrust area, or macro, you have to take that into concern.
Yeah, can I just give a perspective from, I think, how I'm teaching my students? So we started this critical thinking course at USC, and one of the things I emphasize to them is, as Susan mentioned also earlier, this idea of cognitive biases. We are subject to them. And so my goal typically is just to get them to think of one more idea, just one more. So not always stop at your first idea. The reason for that is because we live in systems. And so I would say that even, you two are the experts in thinking about the measurement, but from someone who doesn't even think about the measurement, policy affects all of our lives. So to the extent that those measurements affects the policies, then what I tell my entrepreneurial students is that you can't just think of your business isolated in a vacuum. You've got to think about the people that you might employ and what are their living conditions. And those living conditions are highly impacted by the policies that the government makes that are based, as well as financial institutions and the like, that are based on these measurements. So it's extremely important that we have these measurements and that we measure them well, because it has lead-on effects for even people who aren't directly thinking about those measurement statistics.
So I would just add on, first of all, one of the challenges is that we start to come to these debates about policy, and when people can't even really agree on the numbers or what they mean or whether there's a problem, it can be hard to have a really constructive conversation. So, I go to a lot of things on future of work, and, somebody will be up there saying, oh, everything's good, and, we win jobs, we lose jobs every single quarter, the economy's super flexible, everybody's great, everybody's happy, everything's wonderful. And then, you'll go around and find all these pockets of very unhappy people who are very discouraged about their future, who don't want to invest, and you layer on top of that things like the opioid crisis and so on. And you start digging into facts more, and you realize that, well, on average things may be sort of good, but maybe they're not so good in certain scenarios. And I think when you don't have a really good measurement framework everyone can agree on, then it's harder to even disaggregate it and start asking, where are the pockets of problems. If you think that the mismeasurement is also uneven, then you can't compare apples to apples when you start to break out different groups. So just a few kind of comments on that I've seen in mostly again other people's work that I've seen in these kinds of panels that I've found interesting. One is that actually if you just break out the types of goods and the sectors where inflation has been high or low, you start to see, of course, there's been a lot of problems with high prices in things like healthcare and housing, or at least housing in places where there are jobs, which of course is going to impact kind of the working class much more. And then, of course, a lot of deflation in terms of these, kind of goods that are more consumed by the rich. And so the, breaking out the metrics in terms of, what are essential goods and what are sort of leisure goods could already start to tell a picture about what's going on in the economy. And then second, mismeasurement may look very different in healthcare than it does in other types of goods and services, for example. So, and the share of the budget for those things has changed quite a bit. So at some level, we may need to just, as you say, if we want these numbers to be useful for policymakers deciding, should we invest in training programs? Should we worry about different regions of the country not being able to catch up again? How should we deal with loss of a particular industry due to trade or automation or so on? What should we actually do about it? If we want to answer those questions, we do need measures of well-being that are meaningful for the affected populations. And so I do hope that we can move more in that direction.
Yeah, let me just add, we need to devote more resources to our national statistics and our regional statistics. And the people who work on that are really swimming upstream, although they are making a lot of progress, actually, with flat budgets. Let me just sort of say two things. First of all, there's a question there, or was there, about if productivity is mismeasured, is inequality mismeasured? The answer is yes, and on two scores. And this is all sort of recent research. There aren't like official measures of inequality that make any sense. So we have to rely on research, work by researchers. And the work of Saez and Piketty and that whole group has come under a lot of attack for being imprecise and overstating the extent of inequality. And so that is the way that drift is going, and that's going to be sort of closer to where it ends up. On the other hand, poverty statistics, they capture headlines sometimes. We have 25% of our people in poverty. Well, no, we don't. I mean, there are pockets of poverty for sure, but it's not 25% of the population. There's a recent study by Bruce Meyer of the University of Chicago, who was on the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy Commission, Evidence-Based Policy. He compiled all kinds of administrative data to make some fresh estimates of poverty without getting into the details. He finds that it really is a lot less. And he realizes that that's like a very hot political topic and is going very slowly to, try to inform people about this. So, there's a lot of work going on. A lot of it's going on in academia in conjunction with the national statistical agencies. But yeah, we've got more problems than just GDP.
Can I just layer one thing onto that, which is one reason this is super hard to study is because we're so bad with data in this country. And of course, now that we're all freaking out about privacy and security, it's not like a great environment to say, actually, we need more surveillance of our population. But when it comes to do research, it's really hard to understand what's going on with people if you don't track people over time and if you don't have a more sort of 360 view of those people. So we've just chosen in this country to not really be able to understand the answers to some of these questions in a really good way.
So there's this question, does national productivity growth have a close relationship to a national happiness indices, and should we care more about that? And that's sort of along the lines of what we were discussing. Should we not be focusing on such big, broad measures as multi-factor productivity or even labor productivity, but things that are much more narrowly measured, narrowly defined, so that we have a better idea of what it is we're capturing? I mean, are you actually saying that we shouldn't be paying attention to these particular indices anymore, that we should be focusing on something else to get a better idea of what the economy actually looks like?
Well,
I think we need both. Yeah.
One thing I think is that we need to reconceptualize a lot of our statistics, right? One of the difficulties is healthcare, right? So in healthcare, as we discover new stuff, healthcare becomes more expensive, right? We used to spend about 4% of GDP on healthcare, and now it's 17%. And now that we mismeasure that because we mismeasure the improvement in quality of healthcare, right? But normally when we think, oh, we're mismeasuring quality, we don't think we're mismeasuring something that's like really important. But healthcare is this new necessity, right? We basically think everybody should get life-saving technology, right? So it's an improvement in quality, but it's a mandatory improvement in quality. Right? And so how do you think about poverty, or how do you think about how much somebody needs to earn in order to feel that they have a decent life may be different from what we mean by the advance of technology.
I would just add on to the again, supporting the importance of having the government involved in collecting this data and having the resources to do so is, trust me, the companies are going to do it because they find a way to get money out of it. And especially those firms who are not big, the younger entrepreneurs, they have no reason to follow these laws. No one's going to go after them, so they won't bother thinking about what kind of violations they're making until they get big enough to then, get into attention. So if we don't think about a way to, how do we ensure sort of the equity of access to information? And again, this is a difficult problem, but if we know that people are out there doing it, and we're not we don't have a public interest that is also pursuing that same goal of collecting information in a way that we can use it for the public good, then we put I think, ourselves at a disadvantage, and in some states in a hold-up situation with those more entrepreneurial firms.
One way to think about the impact on human beings is the number of ethical dilemmas that are coming at us from all sides, right? So we've been discussing privacy and surveillance and stuff like that, but if you think about DNA, right, we're already at a point where people are fiddling around with, the human genome. We have self-driving cars and other robotics, but we haven't really thought through the ethics of, what a self-driving car does if it's faced with, killing one person or 10 persons in some, one of these ethical dilemma scenarios. And, the list of ethical dilemmas that has come at us is on every side. I mean, with space rocketry, how do we decide what nation or what company owns what part of space? Deep sea technology is the same. Global warming is another problem. I mean, and these ethical problems are being thrown at us by the very rapid pace of technological change. And yet our statistics are saying, technological change is slower than ever.
So let's actually come back to the measurement question again. So one of the questions here is how can we better measure improvements? And people at BEA and BLS are really good and think a lot about this. And especially, Carol and Leonard, you've worked on some of these efforts to improve measurement and think about what doesn't work from the past. And so maybe talk a little bit about what actually is being done to deal with these problems.
Actually, there's really a fair bit, particularly at BEA and at the Census Bureau. I don't want to suggest that there isn't a lot going on at BLS, but they were without a leader for a while, and they've been very understaffed. And so I think things will sort of be on the up and up there before long. But at BEA, they when I would say it was about 3.5 years ago, they just realized that they had totally dropped the ball on measuring the digital economy. And the director would tell you that. We dropped the ball, now we're going to try to pick it up. So you've had 3 annual revisions where they have incorporated what research they could that was done either by their own staff or by outside researchers. And those are what really led to this increase in the long-run potential growth rate of labor productivity that I referred to, from 1.6 to 1.9, which is a lot. So that's all to the good. But in each of the cases, having been the one who did some of the research, it's like they took a piece of it. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You put in all this work that Dave and I did on communications equipment starting in 2002, but you ignored the 90s and the period before then. It's a little hard because they're really under the gun in some sense, and they don't have many resources. But it's all going in the right direction. At the Census Bureau, they've started to revamp their surveys to try to pick up information on the prevalence of technologies, like where it's in use in different industries in the United States. And I know they did a special effort on robotics because everybody talks about robotics and automation, but we don't really have data on robots and who buys them. So that was pretty obvious, but they needed to do it. And then in the case of employment, it's really been outside researchers that have said, wait, it just doesn't make sense. The CPS says that self-employment is flat, whereas isn't there all this entrepreneurial activity going on? And so some people took records from Social Security and found out that, oh yeah, all those Uber drivers, they're in there, but then they don't report themselves as employed to the BLS, which is very curious in some sense. And they're usually Uber drivers. They're not full-time Uber drivers, long-time Uber drivers, but they're temporary ones. So you got them in there for 6 months, but somehow that all just isn't picked up at all. So even our measures of employment, and again, I don't know what it would be if you put it on a full-time basis, are higher, should be higher than what we're working with. So even the things that we think we can count, like people who have a job, there's plenty of challenges in this economy. So,
let's go to this first question, which is, do the problems with measuring quality and innovation raise doubts about antitrust intervention based on imperfect and limited knowledge by public enforcers? This is actually a much deeper question, which is, and it's hard to answer, but what major policy decisions might we have screwed up because we weren't measuring things properly? Yeah.
So I'll take this slightly indirectly, but I think, I've spent a lot of time thinking about antitrust policy in the tech sector, and I was very surprised and kind of confused early on when I felt like a lot of very sophisticated economists and enforcers were sort of not catching on to what the problems were. And so I started to think about like what made this complicated or hard or different. And I think there's many reasons for that. The platform economics was and its importance in the way it functions was not something that we collectively had a lot of experience with as of 10 or 12 years ago. But also I think that people are not thinking about what is the production process for innovation in the tech sector. So the idea, and then that in turn leads to misunderstandings about, say, the importance of advertising in the economy and the importance of some of the behavior of intermediaries in the economy. So if you think about like a startup, they're going to basically have some sort of economics. If they're venture funded, they're going to be mostly doing R&D, and it's mostly sort of fixed cost R&D. The marginal cost of serving consumers is often relatively low. And they are going to burn money over a period of time, and they're going to try to, and if they can get to sort of break even fast enough, then they live, and if they don't, then they die. And sort of on that path to growth, there's basically a few big inputs. One of them is the customer acquisition cost, which is determined as a blended average of like, do I get customers, from algorithmic Google searches when people are just looking for my product, and then I get the customer for free. From paid advertising through Google, from being promoted in an app store, from TV advertising or billboards or all these other different ways that you get consumers. And if there's a change in the production function of like acquiring consumers, then that can mean life or death for these companies, and it also affects a lot their innovation on an ongoing basis on this path to growth. And if the faster they can spend, the more likely they are to innovate and produce a high enough quality product to then survive. And of course, all this stuff that we love to consume, all the apps, all the stuff on the internet, it doesn't just like grow on trees. And I think somehow the antitrust policy historically was like very static, and it was sort of imagining, there's just like an entry-exit decision, but these firms they're just going to be there. This whole internet full of stuff and great quality stuff was just going to be there, and the decisions we made about competition weren't really going to impact that. We only had to think about the short term. And if you think about everything from predation, even that's kind of an ugly word in the antitrust community, but if you understand the economics of how these firms are working and what's driving innovation, then you recognize what types of anti-competitive behavior is most likely to have a negative welfare impact. So this is like not directly on the overall statistics, but I think it's more just the conceptual framework for actually a bigger and bigger chunk of what we consume, we're consuming digitally. What we actually care about is quality and incentives for innovation. and incentives to enter and start a new firm, as well as incentives to incrementally improve products as we go along. And I think if you understand all of that, you would also have a pretty good framework for thinking about improving the national statistics. So the problems are, I think, very closely related. So I think the more we can sort of educate everyone about the way that this innovation works and the way that consumer welfare is created, the better job we can do through the economy. I'm sorry, just one other little point on this, on thinking about the measurement is, suppose you think about like iPhones and Android phones. Those are getting better and better over time. We've got a lot of saturation. If Google Maps gets better and the Apple Maps get better, or if Siri gets better and the Google Assistant gets better, like both at the same time, we're not necessarily going to sell more phones. And you're not even necessarily going to pay more for the phones because the marginal cost of delivering those things is relatively low, and they're sort of competing for consumers. So there's a lot of these sort of quality benefits that that are taking place that aren't getting reflected.
Carol.
One really important thing is that why is everybody so unhappy? Why, and one answer to that is that you get a 2% raise.
I don't think it's economic.
And our statistics say that 2% raises means you're no better off than you were last year, right? And yet you have all these new devices and technological possibilities, but you don't really think about that, right? The other thing is that I don't buy the slow adjustment argument for the following reason. Economic profits, as BEA measures them, between 2005 and 2017 were 9% of GDP. If you look at the previous 60, 70 years before that, the average is 6.2% of GDP. These are after-tax profits that we're talking about, and it's before the tax breaks, corporate tax breaks kick in. This stuff has really had a huge impact on profitability. We've been investing in intangibles like crazy for 30 years, and it's really paying off big time in terms of profits. It just doesn't make sense to me to say that we haven't had stuff happen. And one way to think about that is we've got intangibles growing roughly 11% of GDP, right? Well, we've got a lot of processes in which we've had order of magnitude improvements in the outcomes, rocketry, DNA, and so forth. And but that doesn't show up in our measures for real intangibles, right? We don't have a good way to deflate.
We don't have the nominals.
With Carol and then Billy. Actually, I just want to say, it looks like we're going over time, but it's an illusion. Don't worry.
Well, I was going to say in response to Susan that I couldn't agree more in the sense that we have to understand the innovation process better in order to collect the appropriate statistics that would allow policymakers to both know what the inputs to innovation are and then measure productivity more effectively. But when it comes to something like antitrust, it's huge. It's really big time. And there's sort of two sides to intangibles. There's those that we measure, like R&D. And let's just say we get the number as defined by the survey, we're roughly correct. I mean, what we don't know is how much of that is a defensive posture to register a patent so that, it has nothing to do with innovation. That we don't know. And we really need to study that a little bit more. I mean, we've seen a lot of R&D activity at the private level throughout, it was maintained through the Great Depression, and it even increased relative to GDP afterwards at the business level. It's like, well, where's the outcome of that? Maybe it's the profits that that Leonard mentioned, but it also could be an increase in patent cases being challenged, patents being challenged, and there could just be increased costs to such like things. So we don't know that. The other thing we don't know, which is something that Susan mentioned when she was talking about being on panels and talking about specific problems in specific industries, has to do with training. Like, how much training, should you be giving to your employees? Well, guess what we don't know? We don't know at the national level how much businesses are investing in the training of their employees. Have not had a survey in this country since 1995.
But the companies can't tell you how much they're investing in training. That's what BLS has found out when they've gone to the companies to ask them, and they've gone to the workers to ask them. We don't know.
Well, they did in
follow this.
1995. They could do it then. We don't know now.
There were a lot of problems with that survey.
It's a lever of policy, that one could just have some sort of broad sense of what's going on, because what the government spends in subsidizing training is, the last time I saw somebody try to figure this out, they said it's like 1/9 what the private sector spends. So, we're talking, a big amount, and then somebody says, well, maybe we should have a tax credit for retraining your employees. Well, you can go to Germany and look at the studies they've done because they have the data, and they say, yeah, that helps. But, it's a different country, different set of institutions. So there's things like this about intangibles that we really need to know more about.
So we can take a couple of questions from the audience. Eventually, we will actually run out of time. But Peter, did you have your hand up a second ago? Yeah. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Well, while he's waiting for the mic, can Leonard's comment about the on average profitability being higher brings up and the issue of why we're so unhappy brings up two questions I saw that came through. One is at the bottom about whether this productivity is actually favoring some groups over others. The answer is yes. And a previous question about whether, the generally inequality is, the issue of inequality, like, does it affect some people more than others? The answer is yes. So the general point is that we have all benefited from technology, but some people more than others. And as we know, our sense of happiness is often relative to those around us. So being at USC, I actually live next to this school. It's not a great neighborhood, but unfortunately, we're so close to things like SpaceX and many of the biggest tech industries. And frankly, my neighbors, those Lyft drivers, the people who don't speak English very well, they are not really seeing a lot of the benefits. Their lives are better because they have cell phones. But I think when we think about how much is their productivity increasing, it's hard to measure. But when we think about these big issues, the big technologies that are happening, that just doesn't hit their lives. And it is an issue that I don't know that we have the answer to, but what I'm happy is that we are discussing them. And I think that's important, and that will lead us to address those issues in a better way. Mm-hmm.
Are there differences across countries in measurement and results? And if so, what does it tell us?
We're actually about the best. I mean, for all the criticisms that we're leveling, we're the best. But the problem is you guys. You guys are changing the world too fast, and we can't keep up. And and these problems are terribly hard. I mean, Carol and I disagree about how good the training statistics are, but
that's minor.
but just think about your own firms and how much that you do, which is bringing up people to speed on stuff. And can you count that? And I don't think that you can. But it's because we're in this world in which knowledge is exploding, and we have to continually run to keep up with the frontier. And there are lots of people who, are very handicapped in terms of keeping up with the frontier, and they don't do well.
Right. I agree with Leonard that we're sort of more or less at the measurement frontier, although there's been a major effort in the UK to infuse resources, both minds and money, to improving their statistics there. And I have a feeling that they're making a fair bit of progress, and it's almost a place one could look to for some new findings, certainly new survey techniques and things like that. And then I think at the other extreme, and also relevant to assessing the United States, is China, where their statistics are very poor, are reputed to be overstated. And there's various studies of these that's tried to, of this issue that's tried to recalibrate things. I know of one that looked at a lot of physical indicators to try to at least say something about manufacturing, and another that tried to leverage the income statistics to say something a little bit broader about the economy, and both have concluded that there's serious mismeasurement in China. And having consulted with NBS a fair bit, they're just under tremendous, I don't understand how they operate, and I've been, I've spent weeks there. It's quite a huge organization, and I think they will, slowly but surely come to terms with capturing all that's going on in their economy, but there's a lot, and it's hard for them to keep up. And they have a lot, and they devote a lot of money to it. I think it's really hard, particularly when you're talking about GDP. If you're talking about indicators of technology, as sort of flaky as they can be, China's really catching up to the United States. I mean, in 2007, there was a report by the National Academy of Sciences that captured the attention of the scientific community widely, and it was called A Gathering Storm, and it listed a bunch of areas in which they saw the United States losing leadership incrementally. Still the leader, but losing it. The trajectory, in other words, was not good. And they projected, this was in 2007, that by 2020, China will have picked up enough to be competitive in the key areas that they had set themselves out to be competitive in well, anyway, look at your watch. It's August 2019. I'd say it's already happened in biotech. And I was reading an article, I know nothing about this, but reading an article on quantum computing in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times yesterday, saying that, there was a physicist, he moved back there, they've made leaps and bounds, and that arguably they're at least on the leading edge of what's going on in quantum physics. So
Susan wants to answer one quick question from here, and then Jonathan, and then we'll have to move on. So.
Okay, great. I just wanted to take the top question here about mismeasurement being a distraction and how we can unlock and spread the benefits of tech. And there, I was actually wanted to bring in some things that have helped my thinking about this. If any of you haven't read Hal Varian, Hal's back there, he has this lovely paper on bots and tots, which is trying to understand the impact of automation on the economy. He makes this beautiful point that it's hard to predict the impact of automation in 20 years, but it's very easy to know how many 50-year-olds there will be in 20 years. And demography is both predictable and has huge effects on labor market and productivity. And as you pointed out earlier, we actually are going to have a big worker shortage in a lot of developing countries over the next 20 years. And so in that environment, we're actually going to be needing to think about how to augment the productivity of older workers as well as less educated workers to fill these gaps. And then another recent paper by David Otter, an economist at MIT, is looking at the patterns of worker wages and productivity over time. And he found that there used to be a wage premium for less educated workers in cities. So if you didn't have a college degree, you earned more when you're in the city. And that premium has completely evaporated. And now less educated workers don't earn more in cities. And he had a hypothesis that that was about the complementarity, that it used to be that less educated workers were still complementary to the work of highly educated workers. And now that their work is sort of more routinized and their productivity is not higher, even in an environment with more educated people and more economic activity. And so both of those things sort of speak in the same direction, and this relates to what I want to do at Stanford, is to say, hey, can we actually change the trajectory of innovation to push more towards augmenting humans? And that really is a policy issue. That's something that we can invest in a national R&D perspective as well as in universities. And are there ways that we can make this tech and make this AI work in a way that it helps less educated workers become more productive, be able to afford to live in cities, and deal with some of this inequality that's going on? So that's just a hypothesis that we would be able to move in that direction. But also there's a bit of a mismatch between the incentives of firms, which is purely on the cost reduction, and the long-term interest of society to have everyone invested and to see an opportunity for upward mobility. And in that regard, that creates a role for policy to push more in this worker augmenting direction. But I think there's a lot of potential for that because worker augmentation delivered digitally has very low marginal cost. So it really is something where you can do the R&D once, but then have it impact a lot of people's lives.
Jonathan.
Thanks. Jonathan May, Communications Daily. We hear a lot in Washington about how private sector interests and also government agencies can share data better with each other, and that seems to be a big suggestion for helping measurement of things like productivity. So I'd just like to hear from as many of the panelists as possible about how that could be, widely implemented.
There's initiatives in all of the agencies to exploit private data to the extent possible. And in many cases, they are working directly with relevant firms to help speed up that process. The research that's been done tends to come to a very interesting conclusion, which is that the private data can be wonderful at augmenting existing statistics to tell you more about what's really going on at the regional or micro level, but it can't supplement the broad surveys that sort of ground a lot of the basic statistics, and that's even true for administrative data from government sources. Less true, but still even true. So I think we still need to look for fundamental productivity improvements of the agencies themselves and the ability for them to adjust their surveys and keep up with the changing economy, and then use the private data to supplement that.
Can I just add on to that? I was on the Federal Economic Statistics Advisory Committee for a couple years when we were working on this idea.
Yes.
One place, though, where I think there really is a big benefit is that historically we collected, for consumers, we collected price information separately from quantity information. And that,
Still do.
And that, exactly. And that is a problem because people buy more stuff when they're on sale. And if you look at grocery scanner data, it's just a huge, huge issue just to get how big the magnitude can be. So one place getting administrative data from firms can really help is you see the transaction, the price and the quantity at the same time.
And that's happening. They're doing that that now, working with Amazon. But, again, they're getting at goods. It's a small
Yeah, one
sliver of
piece of it.
services, yes.
But my point is that it isn't the data that's the fundamental problem. The problem is conceptual. The problem is that it's hard to measure quality, and that quality is not the same for all consumers. We live in a knowledge economy, and what the most valuable thing that happens in our economy is communication. But communication depends not only on the sender, it depends on the receiver, how well prepared the receiver is to process the information. And that is very widely dispersed across the population. And a model of economy in which you think that there is a quality just doesn't make sense. And this is a huge task for the economics community to wrap its head around. And I think we need a major cooperative effort between the economics community and the statistical agencies, and we needed major advances in the increases in the statistical agency budgets.
So we should probably wrap it up there. As Nathaniel tweeted, this didn't go over, it was just mismeasurement of the time. But thank you all very much. I thought this was really interesting. We could have gone on all day, but we will have other panels to get to. Thank you very much. So the TechLash panel, I believe, is up, right, Tom?